Oh, hello, everyone. We're delighted to have all of our guests and viewers joining us today. My name is Ilmar, and I'm your host for today's session. This is the second webinar in our informative series presented by KYC AML Guide. Our focus today is on the countering identity spoofing, addressing false acceptance rates, and false rejection rates. Biometric verification is deemed as highly secure, but can be possibly susceptible to identity spoofing, where criminals exploit systems using deception and technology. Biometrics is quite a complex science impacted by specific user traits and external variation, as well as differences in biometric readers' sensitivity settings. False acceptance rates and false rejection rates measures are vital for any system effectiveness. Balancing these two metrics is crucial not to be lacking either in security or, on the other hand, user convenience. Today we will cover ideal benchmark for false acceptance rate and false rejection rate, countermeasures against advanced identity spoofing, legislation standards, and how vendors handle sensitive personal data in accordance to GDPR. So we will definitely dive deep into these and other topics with the help of our expert guests. So let's give them time to introduce themselves. Today we have Jay Meyer. Hello, Jay.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Jay Meyer. I'm the SVP of North American Operations for a little company called FaceTech. Although my role has nothing to do with operations. I'm the chief explainer, chief evangelizer. I give speeches and things like that. Prior to FaceTech, I was a consultant to the identity management industry, in particular biometrics and cryptography industries. And prior to that, I was a securities analyst and an economist in capital markets. And my security analyst research focus was on biometrics, cryptography, and smart cards. And in 2006, I wrote a book all about this stuff. And seems like things are starting to happen. So that's good.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And please welcome our second guest, Paul Gracie.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me. I'm currently a principal product manager at Amazon, focusing on our retail identity management portfolio. Prior to working at Amazon, like Jay, I was in the consulting field. I also spent 4 years at NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, working on identity guidance and standards. And I am currently the chair of the Identity Validation Working Group at the FIDO Alliance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. So if everybody's ready, let's start with a round of our first questions. First topic that we will kind of dive deep in is the false acceptance rate and false rejection rate. So Paul, how would you define the false acceptance rate and false rejection rate? For example, what does a 1 in 10,000 false acceptance rate mean in practice, especially when we consider it kind of a probabilistic measure?
Yeah, so FAR and FRR really kind of depends on the use case. So the real technologist may challenge my definition, but for simplicity, I look at it from a perspective of bad actor, good actor. False accept is letting the bad actor in when you shouldn't. False reject is keeping the good actor out when you should not. And then the 1 in 10,000 is basically the allowance we provide or we give for a given system in production to meet the security requirements of I think that came from 863. It's a poor corollary, but the best we had at entropy. Some way to get to a way to calculate entropy around biometrics, because it is probabilistic. Entropy doesn't work. So we felt at that time 1 in 10,000 was an appropriate false reject rate or false accept rate, given other security characteristics of the system. Though I think NIST is increasing that to 1 in 100,000 with the current release.
So is there a need for false rejection rate and false acceptance rate thresholds for specific identity verification use cases or industries, such as, for example, separating KYC for banks, matchmaking apps, like etc.?
There is, but it's gonna vary based on the industry use case you're talking about. Clearly, for KYC, AML, banks may have a higher requirement. For retail, depending on what the retail use case is, perhaps it's purchasing age-restricted products. Our requirements may not be as stringent as others. But I think it's certainly a good benchmarking, but it's not the only metric that I would use. It doesn't account for bias in systems. And I know Jay and FaceTech have done a lot there. And it also, it's hard, really hard to look at what's ground truth. Who is actually accepting? Who is accepted? Who actually is being rejected? Why are they being rejected? Why are they being accepted? And how can we tune a solution in production to account for the FAR and the FRR, such that we are increasing our security over time without sacrificing usability?
Okay, so we're basically focusing more on users than on the company risk appetite per se, kind of.
I think you got to focus on both. Clearly, you don't want to create thresholds that create insecurities in your workflow. But at the same time, we want to make sure that these solutions are inclusive and don't, inappropriately leave people out of the system.
So now we will go to Jay. Maybe you can add also on top of those questions. And also, does anything like an ideal false acceptance rate or false rejection rate actually exist in liveness verification?
Well, I'm glad you said liveness, because that's an important distinction between liveness and biometric matching accuracy. Okay. The benchmark that you mentioned, 1 in 10,000 for a false accept rate, that should be viewed as a relationship to the false reject rate, right? And the standard benchmark for measuring biometric matching is with a false reject rate fixed at 1%. The benchmark is to have a 1 in 10,000 false accept rate. Okay. And you have to think about false reject and false accept relative to one another, and almost as a teeter-totter or a balance, right? As you increase false accept rates, you start allowing more people to get through. You accept a higher error rate for false accept. The false reject rate tends to fall, or false reject rate tends to fall. And conversely, if the false reject rate, you want it, high, if you are trying to ensure that anybody, that the user always gets in, all right, they're never blocked out from the resources that they're trying to access, you effectively are making it less accurate, and you are, without stating it objectively, you're actually making it easier for the wrong person to get in. The false accept rate goes up as the false reject rate goes down, and the inverse. Liveness is a very different situation, although they're related. Okay, we use FaceTech as a liveness vendor first and a biometric matching vendor second. Liveness is much more sensitive to false accept. A breach, it only takes one breach to cause major problems, right? And with the advent of AI and artificial intelligence based spoof attacks, deep fake injection attacks, it's becoming harder and harder to detect whether or not it is a computer generated image or a injected video, or if it's a living, breathing human being on the other end of the pipe, right? And so we advocate that false accept rate for liveness should be at 0, right? Now, even that needs a little bit of explanation because you don't know what you don't know, right? There are new attacks every day, new vectors, new ways that these criminals are trying to do things, and you may not have seen it before. So a false accept rate of 0 for known spoof attacks is what we strive for. If we are aware of a particular type of spoof attack, we will not accept any errors in that way. And we've seen a lot because we're the only vendor out there with a spoof bounty program. We stand up our technology and let anybody that wants to try and break it. And we'll pay you if you can. Make sense?
Yeah, thanks for such a specific and detailed answer regarding the FIR and FRR. But are there any other important measurements for biometric verification success besides those two? And I mean, of course, focus on liveness, as you mentioned, but are there any other?
Well, that's a kind of an oversimplified question. Yeah. I think conceptually about these things, and I think Paul kind of alluded to that too. I like to say, if you don't know who you're enrolling in the system, you don't know who you are authenticating later, right? And so identity verification, you have to know that it is a living human being first. And if it's not, there's no reason to go further, right? And then you want to make sure that this is the person who they are claiming to be. And that means that you have to have access to verified identity data about that person, right? So is it a living human being? Is the identity legitimate? And is this person claiming that identity actually the person that's entitled to claim that identity, right? I don't know if there's measurements for that, but based on the way organizations are trying to verify identities in remote unsupervised environments today, that absolutely needs to be measured because most of these vendors have no idea if their algorithms are actually able to verify an identity accurately today.
Oh, thank you for that explanation. And it kind of makes sense because you have to know who are you verifying. I also heard that in recent years, there are new technologies which basically can measure the blood flow in the liveness check, which would kind of make a lot of,
liveness isn't new. I mean, liveness has emerged and become critically important in the last few years, right? But it's not new. Organizations have been studying liveness and largely academically for 30 years, right? And there's a lot of different ways to do it. Blood flow, heart rates, there's a lot of, there's any number of ways to try and determine if someone is alive, but some ways just don't work very well and other ways work much better.
Yeah, we will definitely also highlight those things, but let's maybe dive deeper into identity spoofing per se. So, Paul, what are the most common types and components of identity spoofing and currently the most pronoun ways to spoof someone's identity from your experience?
Well, there's many different attacks. I'd like that Jay talked about kind of the life cycle of a complete identity verification transaction, which includes going into records and and doing checks to make sure that it's, we're dealing with a single human that's alive, and then moving on down through the biometric checks. So, very simple attacks could just be caused by data breaches that are out there. Other attacks could be due to, broader data breach attacks where biometrics are leaked, and could be constructed because of those breaches. Everyone's talking about AI ML today as a threat vector. We see that as well, and we're testing and working against that. But we've seen very simple attacks. I look at these spoof attacks as a function of time and money, and we've seen over and over again some of the simplest attacks could be just a picture pasted over a license, or a paper mask, or a phone, replaying a video or an image, able to beat these systems. So I would say, we could sit here and ramble on about the types of attacks all day long, but really what we got to look at again is use case, what the risk threshold is of your organization, what are you giving access to, how risky is that service or transaction, and then test for those attacks you think might be common. And they aren't all AI ML. They could be very, very low fidelity, yet successful.
Okay, fair enough. So let's maybe dive deep a bit more about the identity verification vendors. So Jay, where does the burden of compliance lie? Are identity verification vendors willing to take responsibility for the social consequences arising for the false acceptance rates, let's say, or does it fall kind of more on the umbrella of regulating bodies? What do you think?
It's almost not a fair question. It's too broad. I mean, who's responsible for a data breach? Is the vendor is the biometric liveness vendor responsible, or is the organization that implemented, presumably implemented a system to try and avoid these issues? Are they responsible? Who's damaged? How big is the damage? Right? Does anybody really care? The historically, we have, and I've been following this industry or working exclusively in this industry for about 30 years now. Historically, the regulatory framework, the legal framework, has not been supportive of enhancing higher security to protect the consumer. It just never has. Okay, companies historically don't care about an individual consumer's identity and the problems they have if their identities are compromised, right? Regulators and the law have changed and are really starting to change, such that the value of these liabilities are starting to be transferred to actual vendors that should have done more to protect that information. Okay. In fact, there's some case law in the U.S. today that shows that in one particular case, a judge allowed that a vendor who was, I don't know what kind of company it was, but let's just say hypothetically that it was a bank, right? That a bank was compromised, a bunch of identity data was stolen, and that identity data was then used to hack into something else, right? Like another bank. Well, the judge ruled that the bank that was hacked in the first place, where the identity data was stolen from, they actually bore the burden of liability for the hack in the second bank, right? Because they should have done more to protect these important identity data points. And so we're starting to see this happen, and but there's other types of liability as well, right? I mean, there's the financial liability of a breach, but there's also privacy issues out there. And one famous infamous law in the biometric industry is the state of Illinois and their Biometric Identity Privacy Act, or BIPA. And that law has massive, massive teeth. It basically allows for virtually unlimited damages in class action litigations against companies that don't manage people's biometric data well, right? And it has very strict guidelines about what you can and cannot do with biometric data, where it can be stored, how it can be stored, blah, 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 blah. And there are many, many class action lawsuits that are being tried today. And the plaintiffs are getting huge awards, okay? That is all against biometric vendors, it's against identity management vendors, but it's also against the companies that utilize those systems, right? And so actually, I think it's a good thing. I think we need to have this framework developed. We need to have these conversations, as painful as they are for everybody, because what this really does for the biometrics industry is show that it is not a question of if we should use it, it's a question of how we should use it and how should we use it properly, right? Which means we're in the mainstream today. That's exciting for us. Make sense?
Yeah, so you're more on the stricter side of things, I guess, in terms of legislation and laws than regarding the biometrics.
Well, our stated objective is to eliminate fraud in the internet. Okay, we are, just to be clear, FaceTech is a software supplier. We sell a product to other organizations that would use our technology in their systems. Okay, we are not a service provider at all, and because of that, we do not touch any consumer PII, no personal identity information, nothing like that. We don't touch any biometric data, none of that. Our customers and partners would touch that information, and based on our best practices, we think they can be safe, but sometimes they don't follow best practices, like they move biometric data somewhere that they shouldn't have, and they get sued, and the damages are high, which to me I think is actually kind of a good thing. If we're gonna stop cyber breaches and frauds and identity related crimes out there, there needs to be some liability and there needs to be some pain felt by organizations other than the consumers whose identities have been stolen, right?
Yeah, I'm sure many will agree with you. So let's go more specific about the specifics of NIST, who has been the institution basically conducting the research in the area of biometrics for over 60 years already. So Paul, since if we take a bank-grade KYC, document authenticity plays a really equally important role in tandem with liveness and face matching. So does NIST have devised adequate standards for, let's say, document authentication as well as persons, let's say?
It wouldn't be fair for me to fully comment on whether what NIST is doing is adequate. I would, I could be self-deprecating and say what we did in the version that's still out there, that's being revised right now, is it needs more. And I believe NIST is working hard on an update there, and seeing what they can do. That said, NIST's role is not to necessarily define standards; it's to leverage industry standards where they exist and only fill the gap where it's needed for U.S. government, federal government use cases. And to that, I'd point them towards what we're doing in the FIDO Alliance, which is where we actually have a DocAuth certification program and a face match certification program, which includes liveness. I would refer folks there to certify their vendors' technologies against those set of standards rather than just leverage what NIST has. I think when you look at NIST, and let's be specific about NIST, the special publications are guidelines for the federal government only. They're not standards. Now they get adopted by industry and referenced by industry, which is great. But there are, where we can, and we did this in 863, we reference industry standards that are appropriate. And FIDO, I think, would be one of those. What's going on in ISO around liveness would be another reference that we called out. Maybe a good time for Jay to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry,
no worries.
I shouldn't have done that, but I did, and I apologize. If I could just make one quick comment, we're talking about industry standards for document verification and document validation and blah, blah, blah. And we're talking about industry standards for liveness, for example. Well, there aren't any standards for document verification or validation. Okay, they don't exist, and so there's no standards for NIST to include in something like 863. And it's a real source of confusion out there because the IDV vendors, the identity verification vendors, they're just crawling out of the woodwork, right? Because it's relatively easy to do what they do. And so there are thousands of these vendors out there that claim that they can tell you if a credential is actually real or not. And they have no ability to benchmark that measurement at all, right? So anytime a vendor says, oh yeah, there's one vendor in particular that claimed that the industry average was like 57% accuracy, in identifying a fraudulent driver's license, for example, but they were doing so much better because they were at 87%, right? They don't explain where that information came from. They don't explain how they came to those summaries. And by the way, 87% is atrocious, and it is a guarantee of a hack, right? So, the benchmarking is just starting, right? The industry is just starting to realize that they have to start measuring this stuff. And in liveness, another example, there's one standard out there for pad testing, and pad testing, that standard was issued in like 2017, and it really hasn't been updated. It's effectively measuring things that were a threat in 2017 and instructing on how to measure defenses against those things, but it hasn't really evolved. And so, you have companies that are out there saying, oh, we passed this, pad, we are standards compliant, but they're compliant with a standard that isn't even applicable anymore. Nobody's worried about, I know we see rubber masks sometimes and we see people, doing this sometimes, but the stuff that is really becoming pervasive today, like injection attacks of deepfake puppets, the standard doesn't even approach that. Arguably, that's not exactly a biometric spoof. It's more of a cybersecurity attack, an injection attack, but so it could be different. But I think it's important to clarify that these standards are just emerging, and they need to change a lot because the hacks are not slowing down. The hacks are evolving faster than the standards are. Make sense?
Yeah, totally. But let's go back to Paul. You might use NIST or maybe some other basically standards if you would like. But how are they kept up with the advent of GenAI, which was already mentioned, identity spoofing, or using, let's say, artificial intelligence in those? And also, on top of that, if you're aware, how would you rate the 2022 NISA, which is European Union Agency for Cybersecurity Guidelines, remote identity proofing guidelines, and maybe some other countries' developments as well?
I think I can't answer the NIST question, unfortunately. I just haven't been there in a while. I know that they're being asked by Congress and the executive branch to look into this. I know my old colleagues that are still there are looking at threat models, rigorously before they create a special publication or any other type of documentation around how to shore up these systems. But to what's happening on a day-to-day basis, to Jay's point, um, you know, whether it's injection or an actual pad attack, or liveness attack, what they're doing around AI, I can't really speak to. The problem with these standards around verification and validation, and I put what I wrote in 63 in this bucket, is we made them so outcome oriented that they're almost too hard to implement, and to some extent very confusing in terms of how to implement them. I think there needs to be a simplification of these standards. I think there needs to be some improvement around the security. I think, to Jay's point, the standards just aren't necessarily keeping up with the attacks that are out there. So some sort of more flexible framework needs to be created. That's why we went to outcome based, because we were trying to not, force a specific implementation or a specific technology. We were looking for specific outcomes. But I think implementation guidance is helpful as well, so that folks can see how an actual standard is implemented. And they also get a little bit too generic because they're trying to cover every use case in one, nice top to bottom flow. That's my critique of everything that's going on around the identity verification standard space. I do think organizations should and could look at something like NIST and profile it for their use case. I don't see a lot of organizations necessarily tailoring or profiling these standards in a way that makes sense for them. Rather, they're just trying to comply with everything and anything, independent of their risk levels.
Do you think your expectations, which you outlined, could actually emerge in the next, let's say, 10 years? Maybe simpler outlines and some other things you would like to see at least? Could it be possible?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, again, with my knowledge of what's going on inside of NIST today, they plan on releasing another version this year. So, and there's a draft out there now that I think does a really good job of addressing some of the critiques that I have about what I did back in the day. So, we can see something as early as this year addressing a lot of this, but, to get that at global scale is a whole different story.
Fair enough. I think me and our viewers should definitely look this new NIST draft to kind of get to the current times of it as well. So maybe let's go to Jay. What is the cost for false acceptance rate and false rejection rate for businesses? And in your experience, how do technology buyers assess their purchase decisions, or how should they?
What's the cost? Well, that's open for definition. What does it cost to have an adequate false accept rate versus an adequate false reject rate? Or what is the economic implications, the economic cost of, bad, horrible FAR and FRR statistics? The FinCEN, the U.S. Treasury Department's Financial Crime Enforcement Network, which is the organization that regulates KYC and AML for banks, right? They just published a report, in fact, today. They did a tally of identity-related problems and hacks and crimes in the U.S. financial sector in 2021, and they said it was like $212 billion, and stolen credentials were pervasive. It was a huge number, and that was just in U.S. financial institutions overseen by FinCEN, right? That has nothing to do with anything outside of the upper echelon of banking, right? So the cost is ridiculous. But I think a better way to talk about that, that cost is now being borne out in government and in other areas like insurance companies that insure companies against cyber crimes. Those insurance policy, the prices of those are skyrocketing. Okay, so the costs are going up, and it's the economics of those costs that are causing entities to kind of think twice about whether or not user experience is as important as they originally said a couple of years ago, right? But I think the better way to talk about this is in terms of a risk profile. Okay, nobody cares about a 50-cent transaction online that was fraudulent. That's just that's too micromanaged. There's just that's too high a level of scrutiny, right? So the level of security that should be required by stakeholders should be relative to the value of the assets or the privileges that they're trying to guard. Okay, and I would argue that if you want to see how valuable a high quality identity management system is, IDV and authentication and re-verification system is, make insuring against cyber attacks illegal for a few days and see how quickly the companies start to invest in these capabilities, right? There's been a lot of passing the buck to places where the company doesn't affect their profit and loss statement, right? But so as assets, what do they do with this stuff? The hackers are 85% of the time they're just trying to gain control of a credential that gives them the ability to get access to a domain or an asset or a privilege of some type, right? And they are literally trying to steal credentials. That's 85% of the hacks today. And those credentials are used for stupid little things that don't matter, like reading your news, right? Or they are credentials that matter a lot, like the keys to the kingdom, the CFO office, right? Something like that. As those values increase, the scrutiny that must be applied to the claimant must also increase. And if they do it properly, the cost doesn't have to be egregious, and the savings are huge.
I agree with you that basically companies should focus a lot more on security, but would it affect some technical aspects of the liveness check or KYC, for example, the time for the liveness verification, or let's say response time? Would it be like a problem that, let's say, some businesses would buy vendors who are faster, but let's say kind of less secure?
Yeah. Well, that's a little different kind of a question. What's the trade-off between user experience and friction, right? And security, excuse me. At FaceTech, we use what is called passive liveness, which means that our AI is literally measuring as many as 60 or 70 different aspects of a person's face, including its three-dimensionality. It's far superior to anything else out there. Passive is important because it relies on involuntary human cues, okay? Things that people don't have control over. And they're secret. They're things that the hackers can't identify and then try and program some type of a deepfake breach around that, okay? As opposed to active liveness, which many of us are familiar with, where the system says, okay, turn your head from left to right, or blink your eyes, or cough, or whatever it is, right? Those are active. Well, those are all things that AI today is capable of spoofing, right? Instantaneously, right? And if it's shown that an organization is using that active liveness, whatever it is, the hackers will sit there and work on that until they figure it out. And once they figure it out, that's all they're going to do. And they're going to break that system every single day, because they'll know how to get through that liveness. With passive liveness, you randomize the attack vector. They don't know what to measure. An example might be when you move your face closer to the screen, as you have to with our system. You have to move the phone about 6 inches closer to your face. Your eyes tend to focus differently, right? So they cross a little bit, or your pupils dilate, hair texture is a little different, and we have 60 or 70 different measurements. And, three dimensionality, let's just talk about that for a second very quickly. This is 2D, right? If you can show that this thing is 2-dimensional, it means it can't be a human face, because a human face must be 3-dimensional and to be alive. So, if you can determine 3-dimensionality or inversely determine 2-dimensionality, if it's 2D, you can just shut the thing down because it's an attack right then and there. Make sense?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. There is definitely a lot of science behind this. And maybe then let's elaborate on the last thing regarding the more let's say technical side. So basically, would background glares, different distortions of video processor that you're using or camera would kind of result in more, let's say, false rejections in a way if we become more stricter, or let's say you use also some kind of science behind biometrics, for example, training data sets for a lot of, let's say, real life people, or even just different trainings for the systems.
Are you asking me or Paul?
Yeah. I think this is just the last part of this question.
Okay.
We could examine.
Well, there's the problem with a lot of the face matching systems out there is that they rely on 2-dimensional sensors, right? The camera in a device, the cameras here are 2-dimensional cameras, and they have problems interpreting 3-dimensionality. A face is 3-dimensional. They can't interpret depth very well, right? And so what happens is that the sensor has a problem interpreting 3-dimensional data. And so when you move your face closer to your camera, you can see the face tends to flatten out, the features tend to distort, and those are called perspective distortions. And the perspective distortions are relative to the depth of field, the distance between the camera and the face, right? Well, everybody has different length arms. Everybody holds their camera a little differently. It varies from moment to moment, right? So those perspective distortions are something that most face biometric systems have to overcome, and they can't. They really can't very well, right? So that's one set of error issues that plague 2-dimensional systems, right? And what happens at that point is that the 2-dimensional systems have to focus on different data from the face, and 9 times out of 10, they focus on hue, right? Color saturation levels of the skin. Well, the problem is that information is unreliable also, right? So 2-dimensional systems typically rely on a lot of unreliable information, which means their error rates go up, okay? When we're talking about friction and things like that, we can talk about whether or not a customer will move away from something if there's too much friction. Well, a passive system works better that way. The thing about 3-dimensionality is that it doesn't. We actually rely on the perspective distortions. That turns out that is actually a biometric, right? So we get a higher accuracy rate. We also get a better liveness calculation because of the 3-dimensionality and a few other things. We don't have to rely on skin texture and hue, right? So when we talk about training sets and error rates related to training sets, that's a solved problem, right? That was a problem that came up, and it was sort of identified, and the politicians ran with it, that face matching was somehow racist. It's not, right? There's less data bouncing off of a face that has darker skin than lighter skin, because the darker skin simply absorbs more light, and so less light information is available for a camera to capture, right? That's the issue with relying on color saturation. 3D doesn't have that problem. So, and if you're using passive, the whole transaction can take 2 seconds, right? You can get an extraordinarily high quality liveness determination and a matching determination that is orders of magnitude more accurate than what else is out there. And so the friction is very low, right? And we're doing 2.5 billion liveness sessions a year now, right? 2.5 billion with a B times people are doing this. Friction isn't a problem for us, and it shouldn't be for most of the industry. I think I answered your question there.
Yeah,
sort of.
Quite well. So since we started talking about people features, so according to GDPR, biometric features of citizens is considered the sensitive data. So a question to Paul: how are companies dealing with this sensitive data? Because it's important, and how do basically companies tackle the challenge of GDPR?
So, what I know of is the best approach is to not keep this data. To Jay's point earlier, they're just the software provider, and I'll say, hypothetically, we are the actual service provider that are actually putting customers through this process. In our case, one of our tenants is just not keep the data. Now you got to worry about the system, in real time being protected against some sort of cyber attack where in flight this information can be breached or streamed off-site. But we're just looking at it from a don't keep it if you don't need it. There's some usability challenges down the road. If you lose everything and you need to revalidate with us, you're going to have to go through this process again. But we'd rather have that friction than lose, customers' biometrics. So I would say just don't keep it if you don't have to.
But if vendors won't store the user's biometric data, how would they manage to improve solution algorithms by training with data sets, for example? I don't know, maybe Jay would have more precise knowledge on this, or Paul, you want to go for it?
That's out of my bailiwick. We're not sure. We depend on I've depended on third parties before, and I'll let Jay jump in here.
It's a great question. If I understand the question correctly, PII, personal identity information, including biometric data, is very valuable. Okay. It's important to all of us. And the reality is that virtually every company out there has been hacked one way or another, right? Including all of the PII companies like the credit reporting bureaus, right? They've all been hacked. And for only a few dollars, I can order a fake driver's license from a company in China that looks, smells, feels, tastes, behaves just like the real thing. In fact, I was in Minnesota. In Minnesota, I can buy a fake driver's license from this organization for $22. And here's the thing: because all that identity data has been stolen, right? That identity data is for sale on the dark web. So I can buy this fake driver's license, same barcode, same mag stripe, same font, same covert and overt security features. They are identical to the real thing. Same plastic, okay? Only I can buy Paul's identity data and put it on this fake driver's license with my picture, okay? That is available. The DHS is intercepting millions of these a year, okay? Which probably means that there's 10 times more that are getting into the United States, right? So now you start talking about user enrollment and identity verification and all this garbage IDV that's out there, where they take a driver's license and they hold it next to your face and they say, snap a picture, right? And then they use face matching to match my face against the one that's stored, that's presented on the driver's license, right? Well, we already know that they can't tell if the driver's license is legitimate or not. None of them are any good at it. There's no standards for them to say, hey, we're this good, right? There's no benchmarking measurement for that. That has to happen. but also the face is my face. So even if they have good biometric matching, it's going to say, yeah, this is the guy. So suddenly I am Paul, right? So when I go to a bank and I say, I'm Paul, I want to open an account. And the bank says, all right, our IDV vendor says it's a legitimate identity, right? Paul exists out there and your face matches what's on this document. So you must be Paul. And then I start writing bad checks in Paul's name and borrowing money and buying cars and stuff like that. Or maybe Paul could do that to me. I don't know. So the thing is that I just blathered on and I kind of forgot what the question was. I apologize. Remind me again what the question was.
It was about basically if identity verification vendors won't store users' biometric data, how they would improve their solutions by doing like algorithm training.
If they don't want to do authentication, they don't really have to store it. Okay. One of the things that we advocate, though, is that since you can't trust the identity data that's out there, you can't trust the documents that are out there anymore. There's fake passports out there right now. The highest authority identity data available today is from the issuing authority, like a driver's license issuing authority or a passport issuing authority or a national ID issuing authority, right? And they always have, they've all standardized on face biometrics. They all have pictures, right? That database exists. It's there. They're using biometrics, whether you like it or not. If your picture is associated with an identity, they're using a biometric. So why aren't we verifying people's identities against that information and matching their face against that stored value at the DMV to in a remote identity verification confirmation? Once you have that confirmation, then you can authenticate that person to the stored value every single time, whether that stored value is in the Amazon database or at the DMV directly, or otherwise. And people have issues about privacy and whether or not your biometric can be stolen. I can talk for days about why that's a bunch of nonsense and we don't have to worry about that, right? And I'll explain it if you like very quickly. The honeypot risk is not anywhere near as big as people fear, right? And in fact, there's only a couple of instances where biometric data has been stolen en masse, and those usually were at companies that forgot to flip on their encryption, right? They left their database wide open so anybody could download it. But the truth is that biometrics are not a secret, okay? Your face is not a secret. It's everywhere. And so we should stop treating it like it's a secret. We should stop treating biometrics like they are secret, right? One of the things that you can do when you store biometric data is that you can alter the data, right? At FaceTech, for example, we capture a bunch of three-dimensional face data, liveness and matching data. It's all wound together. I do this a lot. It's wound together. There's liveness data, there's matching data, and they're all wound together. Same data file, right? Send it behind the firewall, you decrypt it, and you check for liveness. If this entity is deemed to be alive, you continue on to the matching, right? But the first thing you do after liveness is confirmed is you delete the liveness data, which effectively alters the remaining data. It's only matching data. That's what you bind to the data file of verified identity data. Well, if somebody steals this and the system is looking for this, it's not going to work, right? The system is looking for a certain combination of liveness and matching data combined, right? So the data that's stored at the DMV or in the Amazon database or whatever, if you alter the data, it can't be resubmitted. The system will reject it. It has no value anymore. All it is a picture, if it's even that, you understand? So, this data storage is important, but
encryption is basically the main way to go currently, as far as I understand.
I think Paul's probably better suited to talk about encryption than I am, but I would agree with you. Encryption is massively important.
Massively important. and let me just go on the record and say there is no Amazon database.
Okay. I'm sorry.
So,
I apologize. That was just off the top of my head hypothetical.
But Paul, do you have any comments about, let's say, encryption, how vendors would store the data? And also, maybe more importantly, should the regulators also be considerate of vendors' modes of data collection? For example, maybe we would go to some area where users would just kind of consent that their data would be kind of taken by vendors or something along those lines. Maybe this will help vendors also to train their algorithms better.
I'm not quite sure what modes of data collection means in this, why regulators would care, but obviously, as mentioned, encryption is very important. It's critical. It's required. I'd be very leery of a storage technique that is not based on open standards-based crypto. If it's proprietary, it means it probably hasn't been vetted well enough and can be broken. Can you throw the question back up there, please?
Moderator, can you please put the question back?
Certainly the modes of collection matter from a privacy perspective. I mean, if it's in person in a very controlled environment, that's much different than collecting a biometric from your mobile device out in the wild. So again, back to it's less about biometrics and more about cybersecurity of your overall system and where can attacks be made. So I think, that matters. Modes of data collection for training, if you're talking about, scooping up a bunch of images from, a camera that's put in a public place and I haven't consented for that to be part of training, I think that's very bad. But I'm not quite sure what else you're going after here.
I think, something on the lines of that maybe some users would consent on giving their data to the vendor, and then vendor would maybe do some further research with it. Also, I heard that there are notions of, synthetic data. So basically also some maybe data or face data sets produced by, again, AI, just to train algorithms to kind of know what is fake face per se and what is real face. I don't know, maybe Jay also could add something on top of that. Yeah. How, let's say, those modes could be also used in maybe near future.
So we're talking about collection of training data for face biometric algorithms. Okay. The first thing I want to say is let's differentiate between surveillance and virtually any other type of biometric comparisons, right? Surveillance is involuntary. It's, you're walking down the street and there's a camera pointed at you and they are capturing an image of your face and they're trying to see if it matches anything in a database they have of terrorists or criminals or whatever, right? But it is an involuntary act. FaceTech has nothing to do with that. We don't do surveillance and we don't really believe in that type of application. There are companies that do, and they're doing very well because law enforcement likes to use that. In virtually any other case, however, the voluntary enrollment in the system is the standard, right? And if you don't like them capturing your face, I mean, these are best practices that are emerging today, but many exist that are pretty satisfactory. I mean, disclosing to the customer that you are going to capture biometric information, and it is going to be, processed for this purpose only, and it is going to be stored here, or it won't be stored anywhere, or whatever. People deserve to know what you're doing with their biometric data, right? And it's up to them to agree to participate or not. And the reality is that Apple made biometrics so cool that nobody cares anymore. I mean, our phones all have biometrics. Our computers all have biometrics. Everybody knows what biometrics are today. They may not understand everything that they ought to know about it, but this isn't really an issue anymore. As far as training sets are concerned, you're kind of touching on a bias thing, right? We have our training sets are massive because we have hundreds of partners and customers all over the world, and they consent, right? We are able to have a massive database for not our database, but we have access to that type of training data. It's very diverse. It's very global in sense, and so our algorithms are trained on a properly mixed data set that is not prone to any type of bias against dark skin or light skin or whatever, right? But the key here is that people have to understand what they're getting themselves into, and they need to be given the opportunity to back out and refuse. And if that happens, they still need to be able to have access to the technology. So best practice would be to have a second form of authentication that does not include a biometric. And most people are okay with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I also believe that although biometrics in the future could be one of the best ways, and even currently, to authenticate, but every user definitely needs to have like a password on the side with it. So it would be more kind of input required from the person, just so it would be harder to fake. However, we're a bit low on time, and kind of from my grasp on the answers, there are definitely some lack of the standards regarding legislation, and it's kind of hard for vendors to really apply to, set standards and also to provide 100% security without really, let's say, sacrificing with like speed or some probably technical disadvantages that would maybe go hand with it. And also, like, of course, high emphasis on data encryption. And although in the last 20 years, biometrics has really, really risen and basically kind of evolved into something much, much, much bigger than it ever was. But so we have a bit maybe time. So you would maybe sum up and provide with some particular thoughts you also wanted to share that didn't went through any of the questions maybe. So Paul, you can go first. Do you have any like last thoughts on the subject?
Not really. I think we covered it in great detail, and I think Jay did a great job explaining some very difficult concepts in a simple way. I'll just reiterate what we said earlier. Risk tolerance matters. Doing your own testing, I think, is very important. There's a lot of FUD out there as it relates to biometrics, and a lot of as Jay also mentioned, you can manipulate some of these metrics in a way that looks pretty darn good when in fact it's really bad. So I think some independent testing and your own testing is very important.
Thank you very much for that, and I agree with you. But Jay, so you want to conclude, maybe give some final thoughts as well?
Sure.
We have maybe 2 minutes.
Yeah, I just want to give a thought about standards and the development of these types of things. There's a lot going on there. It's emerging. Okay. You mentioned the NIST remote identity guideline report from 2022. I mean, I and a couple of my colleagues are co-authors of that amongst about 30 other people, right? It's a very important thing. And so this designation of how to do this properly, this open transparency of what the risks are and what the failings are and what they could be and what they shouldn't be, that's very important. And we're starting to see that coming into the fold. Okay, we're starting to see that discussion out in the public. So, for example, Paul was at NIST. There's a group that Paul probably is aware of called the Cantera Group. Cantera sort of is a certification assessment body that sits between ISO and NIST. and they can tell you if your technology complies or doesn't comply with certain things that are very important, in particular to SP 800-63. Well, Cantera just announced that they are opening up a new biometric working group. And in particular, they are focused right now on deepfakes and AI related. They asked me to be the vice chair of that group, and we are openly recruiting. The point here is that the discussion is happening, okay? The discussion, the measurement, the focus on what makes a biometric good, what makes it bad, what makes it effective, how it should be used, how it shouldn't be used, those discussions are happening right now, and people should be involved. So if anybody wants to learn how to get involved, reach out and I can help you in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm sure a lot of viewers and me personally will also check this Cantera initiative. As far as I know, this is a non-profit trade association that works to develop standards for identity and personal data management. But anyways, thank you so very much for being here. And it was really interesting to talk with you. You are definitely one of a kind experts on our particular subject. And we wanted to thank from the whole of our heart for your time and effort, and hope this was really thought-provoking for our viewers. Maybe they could get away with something after it. So yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Have a
And
great day.
have a great day. Bye-bye.